The city was wrapped in darkness, and the air was biting cold. People rushed along the sidewalks, pulling their coats tighter, their eyes fixed forward, eager to escape into the warmth of their homes. Among them walked Michael, but unlike everyone else, he had nowhere to go. His jacket was thin, more holes than fabric. His shoes were worn down to the sole, and the chill seemed to creep straight into his bones. That night, hunger gnawed at his stomach, and his pocket held only 8 wrinkled dollars. To most, it was nothing. To him, it was survival. A cheap sandwich, maybe a cup of coffee to help him last the night. As Michael shuffled past a dimly lit gas station, something caught his eye. A motorcycle, massive in chrome, stood silent beside the pumps. Next to it sat a man in a thick leather jacket. His head hung low, frustration written across his face. Michael hesitated. The emblem on the jacket was unmistakable. The Hells Angels, one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the world. Most people would have crossed the street without a second glance. But Michael's instincts pushed him forward. The man, whose name was Rick, looked up, his breath clouding in the air. "Out of gas," he muttered. "My wallet's gone. Phone's dead." His voice carried defeat, a sharp contrast to his tough appearance. Michael stared at his crumpled bills. $8? His last $8? He could keep it, or he could hand it over to a stranger who might never remember him. Yet something inside whispered, "This is bigger than you?" Slowly, Michael pressed the money into Rick's hand. "It's not much," he said softly, "but it'll get you home tonight." Rick froze, staring at the homeless man who had just given away everything he had left. For a moment, the world felt still. The roar of passing cars, the flickering neon light, all faded. A bond had been formed in the most unlikely place. Rick filled his tank, the engine roared back to life, and he looked at Michael with an expression he hadn't worn in years. Gratitude. "You'll see me again," he promised before riding off into the night. Michael stood there, his pocket empty, but his heart strangely full. He didn't know it yet, but this single act would change his life forever. Rick rode off into the night, but his mind wasn't on the road. It was on the man he had just left behind. A homeless stranger had given him his last $8, something no one in Rick's own circle had ever done. It was a moment that shook him to his core. But let's rewind for a second, because that night wasn't just hard on Michael. It was brutal for Rick, too. Rick wasn't just some biker. He was a Hells Angel, a man who had built his life on toughness, loyalty, and brotherhood. People saw the leather jacket and the patches and thought of danger, fights, and trouble. But behind the tattoos and the rough voice was a man who was, at that very moment, stranded, tired, and feeling helpless. His wallet had been stolen at a rest stop earlier in the day, leaving him with nothing but his bike and a few crumpled receipts. His gas tank was bone dry. His phone was dead. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt the sting of being truly alone. That's when Michael showed up, a homeless man with nothing but the clothes on his back. Rick remembered looking into his eyes and seeing something he didn't expect. Compassion. No judgment, no fear, just a quiet willingness to help. And then, unbelievably, Michael handed him money. His last money. Rick had tried to refuse. "Brother, I can't take that. You need it more than me," he had said. But Michael shook his head. "I'll figure it out. You need to get home." It wasn't the amount. It wasn't about $8. It was about the heart behind it. In Rick's world, loyalty was everything. Brotherhood was everything. And here was a man, not wearing a patch, not riding a bike, not carrying power or pride, yet showing more loyalty than many men Rick had known. As Rick's bike roared down the highway that night, he made a silent promise. This man will not be forgotten. He had no idea how, but he knew the story wasn't over. Meanwhile, Michael walked away from the gas station with nothing in his pocket. The hunger still gnawed, the cold still bit, but strangely, he felt lighter. He had done something right, something human. He had no clue that the choice he made that night would echo louder than the engines of 300 motorcycles one day. Rick reached home that night, but he couldn't shake the memory of Michael. He had met countless people over the years, bikers, fighters, strangers in bars, but none had left an impression quite like this. He replayed the moment again and again, the way Michael's hands trembled slightly as he handed over the crumpled bills, the tired but genuine smile on his face, the simple words, "You need it more than me." Lying in bed, Rick thought about his own life. The brotherhood of bikers was built on loyalty, on watching each other's backs no matter what. Yet here was a man with no patch, no ride, no reputation, living on the streets, who had shown more loyalty and humanity than some of Rick's own brothers. The next morning, Rick told his story to the crew. They were sitting in their clubhouse, the smell of motor oil and leather thick in the air, when Rick leaned back in his chair and said, "You won't believe what happened to me last night." He described everything: the broken down bike, the missing wallet, and the homeless man who gave him his last $8. At first, the men laughed. "A homeless guy bailed out a Hell's Angel? You're joking," one of them said. But as Rick's voice grew serious, the laughter faded. He wasn't making it up. They could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a funny story, it was something deeper. "Think about it," Rick told them. "We call ourselves brothers. We live by loyalty. But this man, who had nothing, lived it better than most." The room went quiet. Even the toughest men leaned in, nodding slowly. Rick knew he couldn't just leave it at that. We owe him something. Not just cash, respect, dignity. He gave me hope when I was stuck. Now it's our turn. For the first time in years, the entire crew agreed instantly. They decided to track Michael down, and when Hell's Angels make a decision like that, they don't go halfway. That night, Rick sat outside, smoking a cigarette, watching the moonlight glint off the chrome of his bike. He whispered to himself, "Hold on, brother. We're coming back for you." Michael had no idea that a storm of roaring engines was about to come looking for him. This time, not with trouble, but with brotherhood. The next few days were restless for Rick. He couldn't shake the thought of Michael sitting on that park bench, cold and hungry after giving away everything he had. Loyalty meant the world to Rick, and in biker culture, respect was earned by actions, not words. Michael's act had earned more respect than most men ever would. So Rick did something unusual. He called a meeting. The Angels weren't the type to gather for small talk. When they met, it was serious. The men sat in a circle, engines cooling outside, leather vests heavy with patches that told stories of loyalty, fights, and roads traveled. Rick stood in the middle and told them the story. At first, there were smirks and raised eyebrows. "So, a homeless guy gave you bus fare?" One biker chuckled. But Rick slammed his fist on the table. "No, he gave me his last $1. He had nothing. And he gave it away to a stranger because he saw a brother in need. You call that nothing. I call that everything." Silence fell. The men shifted in their seats, and one by one their faces grew serious. Loyalty, sacrifice, brotherhood. These weren't just words on patches. They were the code the Angels lived by. And here was a man, an outsider, living that code better than most of them. Word spread fast. Biker chapters across the state heard the story. Soon, men Rick had never even met were calling him, asking about the homeless brother. What started as a single act of kindness was turning into something bigger, a spark that lit a fire across the biker world. Finally, Rick and his crew mounted their bikes, engines roaring like thunder. 50 strong, they rolled into the city, not for trouble, but for a mission. People on the streets froze, thinking chaos was about to erupt. But the Angels weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for Michael. After hours of searching, they found him, sitting quietly on a park bench, sharing half a sandwich with another homeless man. When he saw the wall of bikes, his eyes widened in fear. He thought this was the end. But then Rick stepped forward, removed his helmet, and said the words Michael never expected. "Brother, we came back for you." Michael was stunned. All his life he had been invisible, just another face in the crowd people avoided. Now, 50 bikers surrounded him, not with anger, but with respect. Rick put a hand on his shoulder. "You gave me hope when I had none. Now it's our turn." They didn't hand him a wad of cash. Instead, they did something more powerful. They took him shopping. For the first time in years, Michael walked into a store, not as a beggar, but as someone being treated with dignity. They bought him a thick leather jacket, sturdy boots, jeans that actually fit. The cashier's eyes widened as biker after biker laid items on the counter. Then they checked him into a hotel. When Michael stepped into the room, he froze. A bed, a hot shower, clean sheets. He hadn't felt these things in years. That night, he stood under the steaming water until his skin turned pink, letting the dirt and the weight of the streets wash away. He cried quietly into the pillow, not from sadness, but from gratitude. For the first time in so long, he felt human again. Rick visited him the next morning. Sitting at the edge of the bed, he said, Listen, this isn't charity. We're not here to pity you. This is brotherhood. You gave when you had nothing. That's loyalty. And in our world, loyalty makes you family. Michael didn't know what to say. For years, people had passed him by, avoiding his gaze. And now, men the world feared were calling him brother. It felt surreal, but it was real. From that moment on, Michael wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just a homeless man wandering the streets. He was part of something bigger, a brotherhood that valued him, respected him, and saw the heart inside him. And what came next would take his breath away. A week later, Michael woke to a sound that shook the ground. At first, he thought it was thunder. But when he stepped outside, his jaw dropped. 300 motorcycles lined up on his street. Chrome gleamed under the sunlight, engines rumbled like a storm, and the air vibrated with raw power. Bikers from multiple states had come. Word of Michael's sacrifice had spread far and wide, and men who had never met him wanted to honor him. It wasn't just 50 bikers anymore, it was hundreds. Neighbors peeked through curtains, kids ran out with phones, recording what looked like an army of riders. People braced for chaos, but what unfolded was something no one expected. One by one, the bikers dismounted and walked toward Michael. Each shook his hand, clapped his back, or pulled him into a hug. Respect, they said. Over and over the same word echoed. Respect, but it didn't stop there. The bikers brought trucks filled with food, clothing, and supplies. Not just for Michael, but for the entire homeless community. They parked food vans on the street, handed out meals, blankets, and jackets. Strangers who had been ignored for years were suddenly treated like people again. Michael stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed. Tears filled his eyes as he realized his small act of giving away $8 had exploded into a movement of kindness. News reporters arrived, cameras rolling. Headlines later read, "The day 300 bikers rode for kindness." Videos went viral, flooding social media with millions of views. But for Michael, none of that mattered. What mattered was seeing hungry men eat, cold women wrap themselves in blankets, and children smile at the sight of bikers handing out food. His $8 had multiplied into thousands of dollars worth of generosity. That day, Michael wasn't just a homeless man anymore. He was the spark of something extraordinary. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Michael had ever experienced. With the help of the bikers, he entered a shelter program. They pulled some strings, found him part-time work at a motorcycle shop. At first, he swept floors in a polished chrome, but soon he discovered he had a talent for fixing things. He learned quickly, adjusting brakes, changing oil, tightening chains. The shop owner liked him and gave him more hours. For the first time in years, Michael had a routine. He earned money, bought meals, and even saved a little. Slowly, he built his life back piece by piece. But the best part wasn't just the job, it was the brotherhood. The bikers kept checking in. They took him to rides, introduced him to families, made sure he never felt alone again. Michael laughed more in those weeks than he had in years. One night, sitting around a fire pit with the bikers, Rick leaned over and said, "You know, man, we've got brothers who've worn this patch for years, and not all of them showed the heart you did that night." Michael smiled. "I didn't do it for thanks. I just saw someone who needed help." That humility made them respect him even more. Soon, Michael started mentoring other homeless men. He'd tell them his story. Sometimes, the smallest act of giving opens the biggest doors. His words carried weight because he lived them. He wasn't just a man who had been saved. He was someone who had given first. Michael's life was no longer defined by what he lacked. It was defined by what he had given. News stations across the country picked up Michael's story. Morning shows aired clips of the 300 bike lineup, calling it a miracle of compassion. Social media exploded. Millions watched the videos and commented, "This restored my faith in humanity." Kindness is contagious. Schools shared the story with students. Teachers told kids, "See, giving matters no matter how small." Churches spoke about it in sermons. Even celebrities tweeted about the power of $8. What made it powerful wasn't the bikers, the engines, or the headlines. It was the idea that one homeless man, with nothing to his name, had started it all. His $8 became a symbol. People everywhere began asking themselves, if he could give, what's stopping me? Donations poured into shelters. Volunteer numbers spiked. Communities organized food drives. All because one man chose generosity over fear. Michael never asked for fame. He avoided cameras when he could, speaking only when asked, but his quiet humility made the story even stronger. He became a symbol of hope, not because he was perfect, but because he was human. The lesson was clear. Kindness doesn't require wealth, status, or power. Sometimes the poorest heart gives the richest gift. Years later, Michael often told the story when people asked about his past. He never hid that he was once homeless. Instead, he embraced it. Being poor doesn't mean you're powerless, he'd say. Sometimes the smallest sacrifice changes the biggest lives. The $8 he gave away had transformed his destiny. It had given him a family in the most unexpected place. It had fed hundreds, clothed dozens, and inspired millions. The Hells Angels never forgot him. Whenever they rode through his city, they stopped to see him. Sometimes they'd bring food, sometimes just a hug, but always respect. To them, Michael wasn't an outsider anymore. He was one of them, bound not by patches, but by loyalty. And Michael? He never forgot that night at the gas station, the moment when he faced a choice. Keep his last $8 or give it away. He thought he was losing everything. In truth, he was gaining more than he ever dreamed. The roar of 300 motorcycles, the respect of men the world feared, and the love of a brotherhood, all traced back to one simple act of kindness. That was Michael's legacy, the legacy of 8 to Friends, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with your friends. Your small support gives us the strength to bring you more beautiful stories.